Well, hi, everybody. I'm glad you did that shout out because a lot of those issues are things we're going to talk about today. We couldn't have a better person to get us started than David Sanger. Welcome back, first of all, David.
Well, thank you. It's great to be back here, Art. It's great to be back with so many of the Coast Guard cadets, with your whole group, and particularly to be back in conversation with you. I think we've done this now 3 times?
This is the 3rd time.
Yeah.
This is the 3rd time. We're beginning to get it down. I hope we do a 4th. This time we're going to talk about a book called New Cold Wars. That's the book. It's available outside. You can pick up a copy. And David Sanger is going to be available before he catches his flight to leave town to sign some of them. So believe me, it's a bargain. Mine is really worn. This is not mine. Mine is tattered. And it was a delight to read. What I found, it's a book about reporting. This is a book about reporting. And if anybody wants to catch up on what's happened since the Berlin Wall fell and where we are today and why we're here, that's your book. David, I was struck by your ability to think strategically, back up the framework with real events, and then harvest 40 years of reporting with personal stories. The confidence that you have built with people who open up, they tell you secrets, they tell you what really happened. They have conversations that they weren't supposed to have. And to our benefit, it's a lot more exciting than something that comes out of academia. So hey, congratulations on the book, and I commend it to everyone. All right, let's just get into it. You heard all the things they want to talk about. I mean, you pose the question about a central mystery, which is really surprising for the great power that the United States is how do we get it so wrong? I mean, about how this era would play out. We assumed that Russia and that China would join the international system, that the world was given to a growth toward democracy. And basically, let's just start out. How did we get that 100% wrong?
Well, it's a great question, Art, because it's really the central question that we are facing today. I came back to Washington to take up a series of jobs in the New York Times Washington Bureau 30 years ago next month. And I'd been a foreign correspondent for 6 years or so. So this was 1994. After my happy life kicking around Asia was ended, to come back and try to do some of this here for what I was assured would be only a 3-year assignment. So you can see how much I've screwed up in the ensuing years here. There was an assumption in Washington that China's need to get into world markets would be so overwhelming that it would give up territorial ambitions, that it would find that the easiest path was to join the World Trade Organization, which happened in 1999, that it would sign up to Western rules, and that while no one expected it to become a Jeffersonian democracy, it would fundamentally move in that direction. And there was some evidence to support that. There were local elections happening in China. Increasingly, when I would go to visit, there was not a free press, but an openly critical press, particularly on the local level. For Russia, remember 1999 was the year that Putin came in. And again, there was this thought that the era of what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history, that liberal democracy was taking over. There was a good sense that Putin would sign on to this. And in the first full chapter of the book, after you get past the weekend before the war broke out in Ukraine and the denial that Europeans were going through that this was even going to happen, I take you to a session where George W. Bush and Laura Bush went to St. Petersburg to visit Putin. And they're floating down the Neva River in St. Petersburg at about 10 or 11 at night. It's June, so, it's light till, just about midnight. It's beautiful. We're all going down past the Hermitage and all the beautiful buildings of St. Petersburg. And the conversation on the yacht that night was about when Russia would join the European Union, not if, when, and how one could engineer Russia joining NATO. Just think about that. Russia joining the alliance that was created to confront the old Soviet Union. And as I've gone around the world on book tour for this book, I've had the former British national security advisor say to me, oh yeah, I was assigned to go write the NATO entry for Russia memo. And in New York, Richard Haas, the former head of the Council on Foreign Relations, said basically the same thing. He was given sort of the same assignment. That night sticks out with me because not only was Putin having this conversation, but dinner was being served by this lurking guy who's standing in the back, who I kept thinking in the back of my mind, I had no idea who he was at the time, had to be Prigozhin. And sooner or later, it took us months, my wonderful researcher and co-author, Mary Brooks, dug out a photo from that evening, and there was Prigozhin, so all the characters are on stage. So to the central question that you raise, was this an intelligence failure? Because if so, it was so much of a bigger intelligence failure than whether or not Iraq had nuclear weapons, or whether or not Pakistan and India would go to war, or what was going on with Hamas. This was the biggest single issue of our time. What would our fundamental relationship look like with the two biggest nuclear superpowers? Was it wishful thinking? There was a lot of that going on, much of it fueled by the business community, which either wanted to see the oil and gas flowing out of Russia, but really wanted to get into China in a way that, today they're getting out, but at the time, just given its growth rates. And so there was huge pressure on a series of administrations, Democrats and Republicans, to do anything you could to develop what at the time, at various moments, we called a strategic partnership, a cautious partnership, sort of depended on the mood of the day. But partnership was in that phrase. And then there was a good deal of plain old transference in that wonderful American way, that what would motivate the Russians and the Chinese are the same things that motivate us. That they would see the possibility of profit, and that would overrule everything else. And just about every American president I've covered since I came back, and there have been 5 of them, have had some variant of that, until Biden, who I think actually fundamentally recognized the truth here. I mean, no one was a bigger advocate of this thought than Donald Trump, who always thought that he could sign the trade deal that would change their behavior, or impose sanctions that would so crush the Iranians that they would give up their nuclear program. Was the same deal with North Korea, right? Trump, I remember when we were out in Singapore for his first meeting with Kim Jong-un, shows me this presentation he's giving Kim about what it would look like if he built hotels along the coast of North Korea facing Japan, because tens of thousands of Japanese tourists would come over to stay at these hotels by the beaches. I pointed out to him the beaches were all mined, but that was sort of a separate point. So I think what we did, Art, was over the course of 15 or 20 years, until it became blindingly obvious that we had gotten this wrong, we found every excuse to celebrate those moments where Russia, China, and the United States had common interests. And we ignored almost every sign that this was turning bad, including when the Russians took Crimea in 2014. It took a year for the United States and its allies to put together sanctions. And the following year, Angela Merkel, then the Chancellor of Germany, signed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline agreement with the Russians, which routed gas around Ukraine, so they got none of the revenue, and directly into Europe. and called Putin a reliable supplier. That was 2015. It was only 9 years ago. And it basically required a mental blindness that he had just taken over a piece of Ukraine that he had no intention of ever giving back.
I mean, this arrogance, this hubris is really sobering. And it reminds me, you wrote a fabulous obituary of Henry Kissinger, my old boss. And I remember Kissinger always saying, insisting on having a psychological profile of the person on the other side of the table that he was going to negotiate with, because he said, if you don't, you're liable to make the serious mistake of assuming that person is somewhat like you. And in fact, we kind of assumed that the rest of the world was
It's interesting you mention that, because I spent, I think you and I talked about this the last time we were together. I spent years interviewing Kissinger for that obit. And for those of you who go on the New York Times site, it's not quite as long as the book, but it's close. It's 10,600 words long, several pages of the New York Times. But in my last meeting with Kissinger, a few months before he died, he had two big worries. One was that the two grand experiments of his time as Secretary of State, the two big bets that Nixon and Kissinger had taken, which was the opening to China, and then the beginning of what we then called détente with the Soviet Union, were unwinding. But the bigger concern he had, and this is a big theme of the book, was that Russia and China were now coming together. That, it was obvious that when New START expires in 2026, and he had the date emblazed in his mind, we're going to be facing a world with no nuclear constraints at all. It'll be the last bilateral treaty. The Chinese have made it clear they're not interested in any arms control talks until they have an arsenal the size of ours and the Russians. And I don't fully blame them on this. I probably would be taking the same position if I was in China. And that the core of why Nixon and Kissinger did the opening to China was to try to separate the Soviet Union and China. The fear that they would come together. And now, a half century later, that was coming to pass. Now, Kissinger, in that wonderful Kissinger way, looked at me at some point and said, well, we got 50 years out of this, which isn't bad in the run of international agreements, right? He was being pretty practical about it. But I think he knew, as he approached the end of the line, he died at 100, that the grand experiment of his time was coming to an end.
Okay, we've got the premise of the book, the first half of it, that's it. Second is the new Cold Wars. Now, why are the new Cold Wars so much more dangerous than the old one?
Well, first of all, it's a title that at the time that we were initially writing the book, we were hesitant to go do. Academics hate this title, okay? And the reason is they keep saying, well, this Cold War bears no resemblance to the old Cold War. And to which my answer is, that's why we put the word new in this title. But, okay. But you'll also notice that there's an S at the end, and that S is to denote the fact that we are not in the midst of one, but at least two and many more, because of the coming together of Russia and China that I was describing. So let's think about, I was trained by Ernie May, the great Harvard historian, who wrote a wonderful book about analogy and its uses and misuses, which I recommend to anybody here who is thinking about how politicians reach, everything's Pearl Harbor, right? Reach for analogy, it's called Thinking in Time. I'm sure it's been out of print for years, but I have noticed, because I've given it as a gift so many times, you can still find it on Amazon or in old bookshops and so forth. And what Ernie used to do was take a big piece of paper and put a line down the middle and say, okay, if you're going to think about using an analogy, let's start with the similarities on one side and the differences on the other. So the old Cold War was primarily a competition between the United States and a single adversary, the Soviet Union. Within that, it was primarily military and military alone, because we didn't need to buy or get anything from the Soviets. Well, that's not true, Art. We needed caviar and vodka, and the two of us would not want to willingly give that up.
No,
But if you had to, you could live without it. And within that, it was primarily nuclear. And it fell into a relatively clear pattern after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the most terrifying moment of the nuclear age. So we knew who had nuclear control on their side. They knew who had nuclear control on our side. We each had a big red telephone. We had a moderate amount of confidence that if you picked up the telephone, someone would answer it at the other end, okay? And so we could sort of gauge if we did X around the world, they would respond in Y way. We weren't always right, but we had you remember these days, we had a pretty good measure. In the new Cold Wars, we have two major adversaries. They are coming together. China's nuclear program is the fastest growing one on Earth. The Pentagon has assessed that by 2030, they would have 1,000 weapons. By 2035, they would have 1,500 deployed. That's about our numbers. The other day, the Secretary of the Army acknowledged in public, I think it was the Secretary of the Army, or one of her immediate reports, that the Chinese were running well ahead of the estimated program, that they are speeding this up. What was the last military program anyone in here can name that ran ahead of schedule? Okay? So they're pretty determined about this. And the problem of dealing with, the three-body problem of dealing with two major adversaries versus the United States as opposed to one is so much more complex, because as they come together, they have so many different ways and pressure points they can put on us. I thought it was not surprising, but still somewhat shocking, that when you listen to the presidential debate the other day, and it looks like that'll be the only one we get, the fundamental topic of what we would do to interfere with the Russia-China relationship never even came up. The two biggest powers we're confronting. When they did foreign policy, they did issues that were right in front of our noses: Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, all, vitally important, but there was no long-range vision. And that gets to one of the central points that I make in the book, which is we have this wonderful American way of thinking that the long term is like 6 months. And China's made it pretty clear, whether they're going to reach it or not, given their recent economic problems, which are not only severe, but I think deeply baked into their system. But by 2049, they want to be the largest military power, the largest political power, they want to be the largest technological power. And I can understand why people run around Washington condemning them for this, but excuse me, this was the US plan after World War II. We were the rising power from the end of the 1800s on. We were going to displace Britain. We did so peacefully. But the pattern they're following is a path that was blazed by us. And so we're going to have to go figure out what the right mix of competition and accommodation is going to be.
Thank you. And those who are going to be dealing with that are here. I'm pleased we have our chair, Peter Kelly, has arrived. Peter, and is that West Point back there? Behind you, is that West Point that came in?
We're West Point up.
You're West Point up here, have Annapolis, we have the Coasties. Anybody got a football? UConn, terrific. As you might know, I teach at UConn, so I'm really glad that you're here. Okay, not only are they posing those international outside our boundaries, they're here. As you write, they have written code, they're into our electricity, they're into our water systems, they are in our election systems. That's a whole new dimension to this whole thing. That adds a level and a degree of penetration of the United States that we didn't see before. And would you comment on that?
Sure. So let's set election systems aside for a moment, because that's a lot more complex and pretty urgent in the next month or so, so I'll deal with that separately. It's no state secret, because the Department of Homeland Security has been turning out reports on this for 8 or 9 years, that the Russians placed code in our electric grid, and that they did that to send the message that they might be able to go turn us off if they needed to. It was a state secret until we published it in the New York Times, that the United States' response to that was to put code in the Russian grid, okay? As sort of a classic deterrence element. And while they kept secret, they deliberately wrote the code in a way that it would be discovered. So, because deterrence doesn't work if the other guy doesn't know you've done something out there, right? And so they wanted to send that message. You'll be glad to know the day we published that story, the then sitting President of the United States, President Trump, it was a Saturday night, published one of his tweets suggesting that we be charged with treason. And then I guess somebody must have told him that in writing that, he was confirming the story. So in all caps, about a half hour later, he turned out another tweet that said, "And it's not true." Which led me to ask the following Monday of the White House, so look, if it's treason, then I guess you guys have to go off and prosecute us. But if it's not true, it can't be treason. They didn't want to hear that. So anyway, the more concerning code is what the Chinese have put in over the past couple of years in an operation that the US has named Volt Typhoon. Don't ask me who comes up with these names. And that is a much more subtle effort to be able to gain access to the utilities that are around major American military bases, particularly those on the West Coast and in Guam and in Hawaii, that would respond to a Taiwan crisis. And the best analysis we can put together of this is that if they moved against Taiwan, they would want to be able to both slow an American response, and no better way to do that than cut off electricity and water to the bases. Most American bases rely on civilian electricity and water systems just outside their gates. So would make perfect sense. And also turn Americans looking inward, because you're not likely, if most Americans, to think about what's going on 4,000 or 5,000 miles away, depending on where you are in the United States. If you go into your house and you turn on the tap and nothing's coming out, or your power's out. And you can imagine the effects on hospitals, emergency responders, so forth and so on. So in some ways, it's a quite brilliant asymmetrical cyber preparation of the battlefield if they're going to go after Taiwan. Election systems are more complicated, Art. One of the great protections that we have, the cyber protections of our election system, is that every state has a different system. And within states, lots of states have different voting, localities have different voting machines and all that. This system is so dispersed, so impossible to understand, so antiquated, that it's actually safe. Okay? I mean, if you were going to go after like the German voting system, they use the same system in every city and town in the country. Because we do this by the states, we don't. However, our registration systems, which are going to become all the more vital in the next couple of weeks, face out to the open, right? You want to be able to sign people up electronically and so forth, at least advertise it. And they're much more vulnerable to being just shut down by ransomware or something like that. And what worries me about the next 6 weeks is if I was a big ransomware operator, I would be thinking heavily about how do you just stop the registration systems, which then gives anybody who wants to call the vote in question the opportunity to say, well, they wouldn't let people sign up. This couldn't be illegitimate, and you can imagine where you go on from there.
And they do have influence through the Facebook and Instagram and all that.
So influence operations are a separate thing. They're not really a cyber thing, although they are accelerated by cyber, and it's far more than Facebook. I mean, just as most of the people here under the age of 35 got off of Facebook years ago because they discovered their grandparents were on it, the Russians, and the surprise this election season is the Iranians, have been extremely active, but in a very clever way. In 2016, the Internet Research Agency was writing its own divisive posts and so forth to try to get at all of those well-known divisions in the United States. In 2020, and much more now, the Russians have figured out that the much savvier way to go about this is to seize on the posts, Instagram, whatever, of real Americans with real First Amendment rights, who can write whatever they want and are protected under our system, as they should be, for whatever political opinion they want, and amplify that. Because it's much harder for any social media to shut down a legitimate political view, even if it's a somewhat radical view, as long as it's not advocating, immediate violence, than to the ease with which we can shut down straight up foreign influence. And so part of the trick is there's just much more of a flood of misinformation, disinformation, and that's just the foreign stuff. Let's not, more difficult issue in many ways is the domestically created stuff, because that is First Amendment covered.
Absolutely. We got microphones, don't we? Why don't we go to questions here? We were brimming with them when Luke kicked this off. Who has a question for David Sanger? Sir, right there. Would you please identify yourself and state the question?
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. Okay. My name is Logan Furman. I'm from Pathways Academy of Technology and Design. My question is, you seem to have a lot of experience with former President Trump. Speaking of the hotels in North Korea, how would you say, do you have any thoughts on how you think former President Trump might respond to China building up all their weaponry if he were to be reelected in the next election?
It's a really good question. President Trump, whenever you asked him about nuclear theory, would immediately start talking about his uncle, who was a professor at MIT and I don't think worked particularly in nuclear arenas, and would tell him about the danger of nuclear weapons and so forth. And that was interesting. But what we had struggled to get from President Trump was a coherent understanding of American deterrence. Because the essence of our deterrence effort against China over Democratic and Republican administrations alike has basically been a forward deployment of largely conventionally armed forces. We did have nukes in Asia, decades ago, but have withdrawn them all. And then a nuclear arsenal here in the United States that obviously could reach any place in China, the Soviet Union, and then in Russia, China, Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union. And then a conventional direct strike capability that could strike any place around the world within an hour using non-nuclear weapons. President Trump never fully, and when he was in office, addressed the nuclear modernization plans, and has not said what he would do when New START runs out, which would be a year and 2 weeks after the next president is inaugurated. There are some in his party who argue for a very large nuclear buildup at that time and justify that on the basis that you would have to counter a combined Russian and Chinese force. I actually don't think that we have to worry that much about that combined force operating as one, but there certainly are going to have to be adjustments made in how we deploy weapons, how we target them in case there was coordinated use. This is a topic neither campaign, neither the Trump campaign nor the Harris campaign, has addressed in any significant way. And let me add to the complexity of the problem. AI is going to change a good deal of what we have understood over 70 or 80 years about nuclear deterrence. There are some scenarios now being studied in US labs about whether or not it would begin to help an adversary predict with high accuracy where our submarines are. And the submarines have always been the safest of our nuclear forces, right? Because they're the most hidden ones. Obviously, the ground-based nuclear force and even the Air Force's elements of this, we know exactly where they are and they can track them at all times, but you can't track the submarines. If that came to an end because of AI tools, we would have to fundamentally rethink both the size and the nature of our deterrent. None of this has been discussed, and political campaigns are probably not a great place to discuss nuclear deterrence in any case.
Another question. See, yes, sir.
Sorry. Okay, next.
And please introduce yourself and ask the question.
Good morning. Mark Molesky, business professor at Connecticut State. Why do Russia and China seem to be intent on becoming adversaries to the West rather than just compete?
Really interesting question. So for the Chinese side, when President Biden, and the second half of the book takes you into the Biden administration's response to all of this, when Biden talks about a relationship of competition, they object to even that phrase, because their view of competition is that it's a form of modern containment. And I can understand why China, 3 years into the Biden administration, believes that. Because the most effective thing that the Biden administration has done in relation to China has been not the sanctions and all that, but the export controls of the most advanced semiconductors and of the equipment largely made by the Dutch to make those semiconductors. These are the $100 million machines that sit in the middle of every semiconductor fab. And it's these most advanced semiconductors that we have given up production of. The CHIPS Act is supposed to try to bring that back, although in my view, far too slowly. And the second thing that's supposed to happen out of all of this is that we're supposed to gain some time over the Chinese by depriving them of the ability to make the chips that are critical for artificial intelligence, for the most advanced military uses. So when they hear the word compete, they say, you're saying competition, but what you're really meaning is containment. it's this set of export controls that when you talk to American officials who negotiate with China, the Chinese, right up to the level of Xi Jinping, complain about the most. And so their view is it's the United States that doesn't really want to compete. What they really want to go do is choke us off. And that's why you see this drive for them to become self-sufficient. What's happening, though, as a result of this is that what we thought was going to happen to the global economy, globalization in which borders meant nothing, and you could ship your chips from Taiwan to the United States and have them here overnight, is going away. And we have concentrated our chip production on an island 100 miles off the Chinese coast that the Chinese want back. If anybody had come to you with that business plan, including your students, you would probably have thrown them out of your office.
We got any Mideast cadets, ROTC? This is your war. These are your wars.
A couple
to fight.
people over here with hands.
Yes. All right. Yeah. Go ahead, sir. You there. We'll get him a mic. Please identify yourself.
Good morning, Cadet Restuccia from University of Connecticut. I've actually taken one of your courses on National and Cybersecurity, Professor. And
Thank you.
going into that, in the early 2000s, the United States was kind of ahead of its competitors in terms of cyber capabilities with like the invention of Stuxnet. However, early administration kind of set policy to not use those systems super aggressively against competitors such as Russia and China. But as they rose in their own ability, they have obviously resorted to somewhat more aggressive means than we have. And in the realm of cyber warfare, the defensive is sort of at a disadvantage. So I have sort of two questions for you, which is, why do you believe that we have sort of stayed on the defensive? And do you think sort of in the last decade or so with the rise of Russia and China being sort of in an alliance, do you see that changing in the future?
Two great questions. And so after this is all over, you'll have to come in the back and tell us all what being an arts class is like. First, the United States and Israel together, as you point out, put together 15 years ago, and I wrote a little bit about this in the Times this morning, the most sophisticated cyber attack that the world had ever seen, and that was what you called Stuxnet and what was codenamed Olympic Games, and was an effort to put code into the centrifuges that produce nuclear fuel deep in the Natanz plant in the Iranian desert, speed them up or slow them down, send them wacky, and destroy the plant using a cyber weapon. To get approval for that, they had to go through layers and layers of lawyers, try to make sure that the code didn't run through the networks of allied countries that didn't know about it. The chances of it spreading out to hurt civilians was very low, and so forth. President Obama, at the time that he was approving this, said at one point to his staff, you know, there's going to come a moment when this becomes public, and when it does, all the cyber actors who are already going after us are going to use it as an excuse to ramp up their work. And essentially that's what's happened, right? The Russians and the Chinese don't sit in the room with as many lawyers as constrained about their use, nor do many democracies, including Israel and others. The operation that resulted, assuming it was Israeli, and we believe it was, in the explosion of the pagers and so forth, it's hard to imagine that getting approved within the US system, just because you never know where those pagers might be at the moment they go off, near kids, in a school, you know, so forth. Same thing for cyber operations. So we constrain ourselves for good legal reasons. The second reason that we constrain ourselves is that we live in the glassiest, most connected house in the world, right? So if you were going to do a counter cyber operation against North Korea, good luck, because there are probably more IP addresses on this campus than in the entire country of North Korea. But if they're going to do one against us, because we've done an offensive cyber operation, they've got endless sets of targets, as we were discussing with the grid, universities, hospitals that have been hit by ransomware. We could sit here all morning and make a list. And that fact that we are the biggest cyber target in the world has in many ways acted to constrain our own operations. Because people sit in a meeting and they start off by saying, yeah, let's take out their missile complex. And everyone says, yeah, great idea. And then eventually somebody comes around and says, and then what? And then you discover that your chances of being able to stop the retaliatory strike are pretty low.
You know, David, if we stop right about now, we're right on time, right, Colonel Luke?
Why would we do that?
I don't know. One of the reasons we would do that is that Megan Tory has put on an exceptional global security forum, and to the credit of the World Affairs Council, which you should all join. Let me just ask and respond in concluding what it's like to take my class. It's terrific because we assigned David Sanger's book, The Perfect Weapon.
Oh, all right.
As a
Here we go.
textbook.
All right. Perfect.
But this one's even better. So grab your copy on the way out. David, look, this is your third time here, and we look forward to the next three. Thank you sincerely very much.
Thank you. Great to be with you all.